for he had married her. Because John had said to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias's daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you." He also swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half my kingdom." So she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." The king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought, and he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. So again, there's a lot going on here, but I wanted to look at just a little bit of what's happening here historically. Jesus's popularity is growing, and it's noticeable. Even Herod has heard of him at this point, and has heard of because of the things that he's doing. There's some confusion, of course. At this moment, most likely, more people are talking about him than have actually spent time with him or heard him speak, or maybe even been near him. So there's a lot of speculation, a lot of rumors going on about who Jesus actually is and how he can do these kinds of things. We've already mentioned before, it's already been mentioned that people thought that he cast out demons because he was, the king of demons, right? Or Satan even, or he was possessed by Satan. Of course, Jesus dealt with that. There are some things we can see in Matthew chapter 16, 13 and 14. Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" Right? So he's wanting to know, what is it that people are saying? Now, he probably knows, but he's wanting the apostles to recognize what everyone else is saying, right? And it's usually not important, but it is important in some sense, what people think or what they're saying. And this is when he asked, who do you say that I am? Which is very important. But when he asked that, the answer that the apostles gave was, some people say that he's John the Baptist, some people say he's Elijah, some Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. That's how they answered. And that was generally true. Now, these are probably different time periods, a different time period than what we're seeing in Mark chapter 6. I'm thinking it's probably previous to Mark 6, but that's neither here nor there, except for the fact of the answers. Then if you go back let me talk about that for just a second. The reason that they thought Jesus would be Elijah was because in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, we have prophecy about the one who would come. In fact, in chapter 3, he says, "I will send my messenger." Okay, he prepared the way before me. In chapter 4, Malachi 5 and 6, it says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike you with a curse." Okay, so Elijah was supposed to be coming. This is part of the prophecies that they were looking for. Everyone knew about this. Everyone knew about the prophecies. They talked about it relentlessly, looking for this one Elijah to come. And you remember, even in John chapter 1, this is early before Jesus even started his ministry. John chapter 1, verses 19 through 21, it says, "This is the testimony of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites for Jerusalem to ask him, 'Who are you?' He confessed and did not deny, but confessed, 'I am not the Christ.' And they asked him, 'What then? Are you Elijah?' He said, 'I am not.' 'Are you the prophet?' He answered, 'No.'" So this is something that they asked about John the Baptist as well. Remember, he was in technicality, he wasn't Elijah, but really he was the forerunner. He was the one that would call the people to repentance. When he asked him who he was, that he says, "I'm the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the path of the Lord." And in John chapter 1 and verse 23, coming from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. So he understood his role and his function. But when they asked him directly, "Are you Elijah?" he says, "I'm not Elijah." In other words, he's not Elijah reincarnated. But even Jesus himself said, as we'll see later, Jesus himself said, if you will accept it, this is the Elijah that was to come. But since John denied that he was Elijah, they thought, well, there's somebody else coming that's Elijah, right? So they're looking and they're thinking, well, maybe this Jesus is actually Elijah. So that's why we have some confusion, because they call John the Baptist Elijah and they're all calling Jesus Elijah. That's the reason for that. We also see in Luke chapter 9 and verse 7, there's a reason for this. I want you to notice. Luke chapter 9 and verse 7, there is another word, another term in there that's actually used in Mark as well. It says, now Herod the Tetrarch heard of all that was done by him, and he was perplexed, because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead, and by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the old prophets had risen again. Herod said, "John I have beheaded, but who is this of whom I hear such things?" So he sought to see him. So this is when Herod actually became very curious about Jesus. Remember, at one point, he even sent messengers to Jesus and says, "Herod wants to speak to you." He says, "What do I want to do with that fox?" Right? He didn't really have the time to go and sit down and talk to Herod. He was out busy doing the work. But he said that you see the rumors that were going around, and one of them says, some people say that this is Elijah, or this is John the Baptist, excuse me, in Luke chapter 9, verse 7. He's the resurrected John the Baptist. When we come to Mark chapter 6, Herod had not only heard the rumor that Jesus was John the Baptist, but he had already accepted the rumor, because in Mark chapter 6, it says, Herod heard of him, in verse 14, for his name had become well known, and he said, "John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are working him." So he'd already come to the conclusion that this must be John the Baptist that has come back from the dead. And because of that, he has these abilities and these powers. So they're trying, it's interesting, because they're trying to understand who Jesus is, right? They're trying to figure out how is he so popular? What's going on? And John the Baptist was certainly a very popular man when he was alive. And putting him to death there would have been ripples all throughout society. So this is part of the reason he protected John the Baptist. But also because it says that he cared about him. He respected him, which is pretty ironic, but that's what happened. Then we have, so John the Baptist then was put to death, and Herod is afraid now. It seems like his conscience has gotten to him, where he feels like, oh, this is John the Baptist raised from the dead, because he knew John the Baptist to be a righteous man, right? And so now this is how he's explaining it. That's another part of this, is it shows that Jesus had some kind of power. For the skeptic looking in the scripture, this is some good evidence that Jesus was actually doing things, right? Some of the skeptics of later times have said, well, Jesus, even of that time, Jesus did magic tricks. There was actually a rumor, from what I understand, going around the time of Jesus, or maybe just a little bit after, that when Jesus went to Egypt as a child, remember, out of Egypt I will call my son, just after his birth, while he was there, they took the magic that was done by the pharaohs and by Egypt, and they hid the magic under his skin and brought him, and they kind of smuggled it back into Israel so that later on he could do magic tricks. I mean, they're coming up with all kinds of reasons. They said that he attributed it to the power of demons, even all kinds of reasons to explain away something, instead of looking at the fact that this was actually what Jesus was doing it somehow. This is miracles. They couldn't explain away his miracles, but they tried to make up another source of that other than saying it was from God. Herod is kind of in the same ballpark. He's trying to explain this away. So Mark has a little bit more detail in here, because one of the things that they said in chapter 6, Mark chapter 6 and verse 15, others said he is Elijah, and others said it's the prophet, or like one of the prophets. Okay, now the word prophet in here And my translation, it's capitalized. It probably is in yours too. This is a reference to a specific person. All right, this is the prophet, and it's related to Jesus. Now, this may be a little bit of a rabbit chase, but it helps to understand the context of what's going on. They thought that there was not only Elijah who was coming, but there was also the prophet who was going to come. Okay, and that is a reference all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 15. And this was a statement made by Moses. Let me pull it up here so I say it correctly. It says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear. Okay, so by the time the first century rolled around, this prophecy had become not just he would raise up a prophet, but that he would raise up the prophet. This is the one that Moses was talking about that would replace him. And in a sense, Jesus fits that completely. But it is interesting because while it has obvious messianic overtones, it's possible that all this was a reference to all the prophets that would come. So they kind of lumped them all together. And this is a prophet that came in just like Moses, and he came and spoke, and the people would hear them. And so God raised up prophets over every generation, had at least one prophet, if not more. And this was very important, except for the time between the testaments. So this is probably what Moses was talking about. But by the time Jesus came around, it became the prophet. So now there's expectation of Elijah. Now there's expectation of the prophet. And they wasn't sure if the prophet was actually the Messiah. So there's a lot of confusion in the religious world right now at this time. And it also, if you have run into anyone who is Muslim, they believe that Muhammad, they'll call Muhammad the prophet. You probably have noticed that. That actually is a reference to what's going on back in Deuteronomy, as far as I can tell. They recognize that, in fact, some people, I've seen people say, Muslims say, that the Quran mentions Jesus and the Old Testament mentions Muhammad. I'm like, how would you say that Muhammad is mentioned in the Old Testament? Because they call him the prophet. And so they say this is the prophet that would come later on. And so they see Jesus as a prophet, but Muhammad as the prophet. So there's a distinction there that's made. So that kind of discussion is still going on, right? We're trying to figure all that out. But it leaves the impression in Mark's account, the way it's phrased, it kind of leaves you the impression that Jesus is not the prophet. So I think probably what's going on is that Moses intended for that to mean, in a generic sense, God will always raise up prophets, a prophet to speak to his people, as a replacement for him. But it is something to consider and think about in the context of this. I wanted to bring that out. So we have in Mark 6, we evidently see that Herod had heard all the reports and had already convinced himself that this was the most reasonable explanation, that John had been risen from the dead, which if you're a skeptic, that doesn't sound reasonable at all, does it? But the reasonable nature of it, there had to be some explanation. And if people were stretching so much to say that someone just came back from the dead and they had magic powers when they came back, that shows you that there was something definitely going on, right? They had some idea there was something that was happening that had to be explained somehow. So they're looking for supernatural explanations. But I want you to notice in verses 17 through 29, then, the reason Herod came to this conclusion, it could be because he had a guilty conscience. He's already thinking about John and he sees Jesus, and it makes sense, right? So he had a guilty conscience. In verse 17 of Mark 6, it says, for Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. I tried looking into the history of the Herods, the lineage. Look into it sometime. It's a mess. There are a lot of problems going on. Herodias was one who actually was a granddaughter of Herod the Great. And the Herod that she married is also a grandson, I believe, of Herod the Great. And there are a lot of things that are going on here. One of the problems is that Herod the Great had about 6 wives, and he had children from all of them, and so they're all fighting for the throne, fighting for something that they could get out of all this dynasty, this royalty that's there. And after a while, I was like, this is just not worth it to me to try to dig into this. I did learn some things, though. I want to share with you. Herod's brother Philip was also grandson of the king of Herod the Great, by another mother. So Philip married Herodias because Herod the Great set her up to be married to him. So she, we're keeping it all in the family here, right? Herodias was actually the daughter. Herodias was the daughter of one of the sons of Herod, Herod the Great, because his granddaughter. Okay, so that son was put to death because he was plotting. This is before Jesus was even born. He was plotting against Herod, plotting against the throne. Of course, Herod was paranoid. He thought everybody was plotting against him. And so Herod the Great had his son put to death, and that left Herodias to be an orphan, right? So, and she was a teenager, so he just pledged Herod the Great pledged Herodias to marry Philip, one of his other grandsons. He just matched them up, said, okay, you're getting married. And this actually, because of that, because the way everything worked in the lineage, and I don't know how it all worked, but this is what they explain. Because Herodias married Philip, who was the grandson, it actually made him next in line to be king over even Herod's firstborn son, because he was born from another mother that was lesser. They all were ranked. So anyway, Herodias and Philip were going to be next in line. Then Herod the Great decided that wasn't fair, so he switched it around and made him lesser. She wasn't going to be next in line anymore to be the wife of a king. And so everything was going well until until the firstborn son of Herod the Great decided to mount a rebellion against Herod. And so he was put to death, and that put them back in line, but they were going to be put to death too. So Philip decided, I'm out of this. He gave up the royalty business. He became a private citizen. And that actually saved his life. It's really weird, but he renounced the throne. And when he did, right after that, Herod died, but Herod the Great died. But at Herod the Great's death, he made a decree that all the sons that he had were going to be put to death, because he thought they were all plotting against him. And that actually left Philip out, because he wasn't technically considered his son anymore, because he went to be a private citizen. Anyway, strange. But because of that, Philip couldn't be a king. Herodias was married to someone who's going to be king, and she couldn't be king's wife anymore, because he declared himself a private citizen, took himself out of it. Why is that so important? Well, that's the reason that Herodias married Herod, the Herod that we're talking about here. Because Herod knew that if he could get her to be his wife, he would have a leg up, because her lineage, her genealogy was very high in the rankings, and would help him politically to be a better king, more likely to be, looked at for promotions, this kind of thing. It's the best way I can explain it. And Herodias also loved the idea, because she wanted to be married to a king, and Philip wasn't going to be a king anymore. So she could jump ship, go over to him, and everything would be great, keeping it all in the family still, right? So anyway, this is a big mess. Well, you can imagine when Herod, who was actually half Jewish, whenever he married Herodias, this caused shockwaves throughout the region. It doesn't really talk about it here, but it was a scandal. It was a huge scandal, because it was against the law. The law of Moses said you married someone and you stay with them for life, right? This is the law. And it was expected at this time for them to follow it. And I realize it hasn't throughout history, it hasn't always been followed, but here it was certainly a scandal. And so evidently John had found a way. I don't know if he was asked by someone else, or if Herod had personally asked him, or maybe he had an opportunity to speak with him. But at some point, John the Baptist made some comment to Herod that Herod shouldn't be married to Herodias, because he says it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife, which, ooh, but still, this is what's happening. So now Herod is in trouble because he's married this woman, and John the Baptist said it. You can't do this. So that I realize that's a big, huge mess, and you probably may not even be able to follow it very well, and I couldn't either, honestly. But this was a political maneuver, and it was a scandal. And so religious leaders, if they care about people at all, they're going to say something every now and then about what's going on in the public. I don't necessarily think that John was out preaching this constantly. It's possible that he was, but it just says that he said to Herod, he told him, this is what it is. And so Herod had no right to be married to this woman. It's very clear what he says. Mark said that John said he couldn't have his brother Philip's wife, even though Philip and Herodias were legally divorced. John the Baptist still said, that's his wife. That's not your wife. That's your brother's wife, even though they were legally divorced. And that's because of the law of Moses. They could claim divorce all they want to, but the law of Moses said you're married for life. And so you can't violate that. There's no way that you can violate that. I mean, you can violate it, but you can't dissolve a marriage that God says you're married. You can't just all of a sudden say we're not married anymore because God says you are. So you are. That goes back to Matthew chapter 19 in verse 9, when Jesus laid it out really easily for them. He says, if you divorce someone and you marry somebody else, you commit adultery. Adultery is the important word there. He didn't say you commit fornication by marrying someone else. He said you commit adultery. And adultery is sin against the bonds of marriage. So even if you divorce and you marry someone else, you're sinning against marriage, your original marriage. And that's the point Jesus is making, and that's the point that John the Baptist made. I say that because John the Baptist taught Old Testament law. Jesus taught New Testament, and they both say the same thing. So it's not ever been a change. It's just been a re-emphasis by Jesus in Matthew chapter 19 and Matthew 5 and other places. This has been a re-emphasis and a re-establishment of what God had intended from the very beginning. So John was saying the things that he said, and it was scandalous, but we know what happens when people tell the truth that some people don't want to hear. What happens then, it says, Herodias, in verse 19, Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him. Now that's how bad this was. That's how angry she was. And anger, it may have been anger, but it was really coming because of the threat, right? If people start clamoring for them to divorce, she loses her power. And now, so there's a lot more motive here than just she got upset because he had an opinion she didn't like. Although she could have been that petty, but it's likely more because of what she stood to lose. Okay. So Herodias held it against him. She was looking for any kind of an opportunity, to come after John. All right. And that opportunity came. In verses 21 through 28, we know the story of what happened, how that her daughter, Herodias's daughter, came and danced. Now, this was not technically Herod's daughter, thankfully, daughter. It would have been stepdaughter, but still. She came in and danced for him and the whole company, and everyone was there. And so after she danced in front of them and pleased Herod, those who sat with him, and the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want and I will give it to you. That's pretty amazing that somebody would actually say such a thing. And then it's pretty amazing that of all the things that she could have had, she only asked for one thing. That's the head of John the Baptist. And that's really amazing to think about. It shows you the fear that's involved, as well as the hatred. So he swore to her in verse 23, whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half my kingdom. Now that's something that kings have said for a long time before this even. We can see that even in the Old Testament times that kings would say such things. And it's crazy to say that. I think it's a figure of speech. I don't think anybody would literally take that literally. He's just trying to be generous. Whatever you want, just ask for it. And that's pretty amazing that he would make that kind of statement. And I wonder what would happen if she said, "I want half your kingdom." I don't know. From looking at the evidence, it's possible he would have at least felt pressure maybe to give it to her, but I doubt that. So she went and asked her mother, "What am I going to ask for?" Right? And she said, "I'll just ask for John the Baptist's head." It's not just the grossness of having a head on a platter. It's the savagery and the brutality of it's a demeaning thing to cut someone's head off and you're displaying it like a trophy. It's brutal and it's terrible. It would have sent a message to other people, certainly, but just the kind of hatred that's there is pretty strange. Let's see here. I'm pulling up the chat here. Somebody had a comment. Yeah, Leviticus 20:21 states that it was unlawful to take his brother's wife. Well, sure it was. That is a direct violation. Let me look up that passage here because I'm not familiar with it. Leviticus 20 verse 21. If a man takes his brother's wife, his unclean thing is uncovered his brother's nakedness, they shall be childless. Yeah, in fact, they would have been put to death because of that. So yeah, it directly violated the law. So it was unlawful for him to have her. And that hasn't ever changed. Okay, so an opportune day came and John the Baptist was put to death because of the girl that danced for Herod. Manipulation all around. So they brought the head of John the Baptist and put it on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry in verse 26. Yet because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her because he had made this promise in front of everyone. Now he's going to have to keep it because he made the statement, made the promise. So this is what he's going to do. And that's a sad situation, obviously. And so she got the head of John and gave it to her mother. I have no idea what she did with it, but the disciples heard of it. They came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. So his disciples heard about it. And like I said, this would have been scandalous. Everyone would have been talking about this. People would have been upset about it, but it certainly calmed everything. I mean, it certainly resolved the situation as far as she was concerned. So that brings up the idea of faithfulness. When we're talking about John the Baptist, it's very easy to see how he could be considered to be faithful to God. It wasn't just that he was doing things to check boxes. He was from the heart, and he understood his role. And his role was Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1. The role he quoted was from Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 3, that he would be one who would kind of straighten the paths, kind of prepare the way for the coming of the Messiah. And in Malachi chapter 4, 5 and 6, and even chapter 3 and verse 1, the implication is that when Jesus came, when the Messiah came, he was going to just pretty much lay waste to everything because he's going to come in judgment, and he's going to come in and he's going to see so many things that are bad. He's going to have to come in and just fix everything. And it's going to be a great and terrible day of the Lord. But at the same time, that's the reason that John the Baptist went in. So what he did was he brought he drew the hearts and minds of the people back to God. So this is what his job was, to bring redemption to Israel. You remember whenever he was out baptizing, he baptized a baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. This is what John was. That was his job. That was his function. And because of that, people all around the countryside came out to hear him. They were baptized by him in the Jordan and many other places, everywhere he could find water. And the whole countryside came out to hear him. And because of that, many people repented. A lot of people turned back to God. They started looking toward God again, and they started looking toward what the coming of the Messiah, all these different things they were looking for. And as a result, when Jesus came, his work was a lot easier. He could build on what John had already built, and there wasn't any reason to come in judgment. He's coming not in judgment, but to save, because the people had turned back. And this was very important for him. It's important that John recognized and did the work that he did. He did a lot of work, a lot of difficult work. But that was the reason, because he understood what had to happen and he was loyal to it. In Matthew chapter 11, verses 6 and 7, says, "And blessed is he who is not offended because of me." Hold on a second. Oh, they departed, and this is verse 7. As they departed, Jesus began to say to the multitudes concerning John, "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? Indeed, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, and more than a prophet. For this is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. Assuredly, I say to you, among those born of women, there is not risen one greater than John the Baptist, but he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." So this is what Jesus thought about John. He said, "You didn't go out to see a broken reed. You came out to see a man of God who was brave, who was godly." And it says that he wasn't a soft man. You went out to see a prophet, and he actually was more than a prophet, because his job was to prepare for the coming of Jesus. That is an amazing responsibility that he had, and he lived up to. So this is a wonderful tribute to John, and it shows his heart, it shows his faithfulness. If you look in Matthew chapter 11, though, it says in verses 2 through 6, it says, "When John had heard in prison about the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples." Okay, so this was when he was in prison, before he was about to be executed. You can imagine how he felt in prison. So he was starting to be concerned. He'd already testified that Jesus is the Christ, but now he's asking the question, is this really the one? So he said in verse 3, and he said to him, or they said to him, "Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and tell John the things which you hear and see. The blind see, and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who is not offended because of me." So the answer to John was obviously yes, but Jesus didn't just say, "Hey, take my word for it." He gave evidence of that. That is, look at the witness. The witness is all the things that are happening. Look at what's happening around and report that to John. Put your faith in evidence, and not get caught up in the temporary distractions of distress, right? And so when we're facing challenges and distress, it's very easy for us to start doubting. It's easy for us to be tempted to say, is this really worth it? Is this really something that I need to be doing? All of us will face that. And the answer has to be a decision to look at the evidence. The answer must be to come back, to remember what our roots are, to remember why we believed in the first place. And if we believe because we saw evidence, then when we are facing the challenges, if we go back to that evidence, it will help us remember what we came to believe in the first place. And that's exactly what John the Baptist needed to see as well. So John was not perfect. He was a human being, and he had his ups and downs, but he was a faithful man of God. And that's what we're trying to be too. We're trying to emphasize that idea. He didn't just play a part, he became the part, right? Think about spending time in the wilderness, eating locusts and wild honey. It wasn't a show. He didn't do that as a gimmick or like a play, right? It wasn't religious drama. He actually lived out there. He became the part, because this is what he was called to do, and he understood what needed to happen. And when he presented himself, because he was living the life that you would think Elijah was living when he was alive, people saw that, they recognized his authenticity, and they came to him in droves as a result, because it was real. It was who he was. And when God's plan becomes that real for us, not that we're eating locusts and wild honey, but when it becomes a part of who we are, becomes part of our nature, people they notice that, and they see it. This is not something that we put on Sunday morning. This is who we are all the time. And the more consistent we are with that practice, with that life, the more faithful we are. That's what faithfulness really is when it gets down to it. So that I'm hoping that this is bringing to light some of the ideas that we're talking about being faithful. It's not just having faith. It's not just being loyal. It's about making the vision that God sets, has the vision that God has for our lives, making it our vision. This is who we are. This is what life is about for me now. And that's what faithfulness is. So it becomes not a matter of show, but a matter of heart. And of course, it will be shown too. When God's mission becomes our mission, we become faithful, not just active and not just paying lip service, but faithful. So I want you to think about that this week. The lesson in just a little bit during our worship will be about that too. It's going to be related to Nehemiah and how vision relates to faithfulness. And we have to have it. We have to have vision in order to be faithful, because we have to see things, not the things that we want to see, but we need to see things as God sees them. And we'll talk about that in the lesson. So anyway, that's all that I have prepared right now. We get out a few minutes early unless someone wants to discuss something. Anybody have any comments or things that we need to discuss?